Okay, well, we thought we were going to have a two-front war, one against Russia, one against China, and now we're possibly dealing with a NATO proxy war with Russia and a possible proxy war with Hamas and Iran and Egypt and that area of the world. I have with me today former CIA Larry Johnson to help me digest the news and give us answers on what's really going on. Larry, thank you so much for coming on today's show.
You're most welcome, Stephen. Always a pleasure.
So, right out of the gates, this has me terrified. Senator Lindsey Graham said he's been on the phone nonstop with Middle East contacts, suggesting that the United States ought to blow Iran to kingdom come for helping Hamas attack Israel. How dangerous are Senator Graham's words and comments?
He ought to be put into a rubber room with a white jacket and his arms strapped behind his back. It's crazy. The United States has refused to see any responsibility whatsoever for what has transpired in Iran. We view ourselves as the complete innocent party. We've just been standing here minding our own business, and these crazy Islamic people rose up and tried to attack us. Now, that's a lie. What happened, it started with a CIA-backed coup that overthrew a democratically elected president in 1953. So we're talking 70 years ago. Mossadegh. He's overthrown. The Shah is installed. The Shah becomes our very best friend, and the Shah ends up torturing a lot of people. There was an Islamic revolution in 1979. And as part of that, the minute the United States let the Shah into the United States for medical treatment, students, Islamic radicals, took over the U.S. Embassy, held 52 American diplomats hostage. So you'd think that because they're holding Americans hostage, we would do everything in our power and might to fight and destroy and weaken Iran, right? No. Ronald Reagan gets into office. The hostages are released on January 20th, 1981. And Ronald Reagan then agrees to let Israel, check it out, Israel sell weapons to Iran, to the Ayatollah Khomeini. Got that? The United States blessed Israel to sell weapons to Ayatollah Khomeini, who had just released hostages. And in the ensuing 2 years, in 81, 82, 1983 was pivotal. Hezbollah is formed, carries out terrorist attacks, blowing up the Marine barracks in, I think it was like April of 1983, and then the U.S. Embassy in Beirut in October of 83, followed by the blowing up of the U.S. Embassy Annex in 1984. And during that entire time, the United States is allowing Israel to sell weapons to Iran because Iran is fighting Iraq, and the Israelis are nervous about Iraq. Now, my point in this, and this was all done under Ronald Reagan, fighting against terrorism, the hypocrisy of our country is staggering. And the other countries around the world understand this. They see it. We're the ones who don't know that. We create a meme and a narrative that Iran bad, United States good. We're always on the side of the angels. They're always on the side of Satan. And it's just not, no, that's simplistic and it's wrong. Much more complicated. And now, if we dare to try to attack Iran, Iran may defeat us because Iran has very robust air defense systems, and we will have to go a long, long ways in terms of travel to carry out attacks. So, I mean, it's just, that's why I say with that background and then what Graham's talking about now, it's stupid and it's dangerous.
Yeah, I looked up and it looks like Iran has about 90 million citizens. So we're going to go bomb 90 million people, blow them to kingdom come, send them back to Allah. Like it's crazy that he's saying these things out loud. Although he is the one that said Putin should be taken out immediately, and the United States should be in charge of a change of the guard there in Russia.
Right.
Some of the stuff that comes out of his mouth is insane to me.
Well, you do understand? It's important for your listeners to understand. You remember Iraq and how big of a country that was for us to move around in. I mean, it wasn't, it took some distance. I remember flying during the war in 2006. I was in Qatar, and we then flew from Qatar up into Iraq. First, we went out into past Fallujah to a Marine base, and then flew from that Marine base to Balad, where I got off the plane. It was a military aircraft. That was I spent about 6 hours on the plane that day, flying here and there. It's a big country. Guess what? Iran is 4 times the size of Iraq, and it's mountainous, very mountainous country. And in those mountain valleys, they've got some of the nuclear facilities hidden. And maybe Top Gun, we can hit them in Top Gun 2, but in reality, that's not going to work.
Yeah. Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine put out a video where he is blaming this war between the Middle East and Israel on Vladimir Putin. I don't know if he's saying this in order to continue to keep attention on Ukraine, or if he is, I'm not sure, because he said, we as NATO need to unify around helping Israel. So is he trying to get himself into NATO by his words, or is he trying to keep the focus on Ukraine as people turn their attention to Israel?
Are you sure he said Putin? I thought it was Trump that was responsible. So, I mean, Donald Trump's responsible. Donald Trump's responsible for everything. Putin's just a secondary cost. No, I mean, it's ridiculous. But blaming this on Putin, Zelensky he's trying to stay relevant. He went from being, the celebrity, the Winston Churchill of the 21st century, feted and carried around on the shoulders of Western diplomats and leaders. Now he's like the picture of one of those kids on a milk carton that's missing. They're looking for him. Nobody can find him, or he's wanting to be found. Iran's in a back burner. And right now, what this means is the United States has a finite amount of our ammunition and military supplies that it can send overseas. We don't have an infinite amount. We have a finite amount. Well, you're a financial guy. You understand economics. What happens when you've got increased demand and a fixed supply? Well, price goes up, right? And in this case, the price going up means that Israel's going to get it. Ukraine isn't. Israel's at the front of the line because Israel has greater political clout in the United States than Ukraine does. That's simple.
Yeah, well, and didn't the United States convince Israel to give 155 caliber ammunition to Ukraine?
Yeah, I'm sure they did that with a clawback provision, to get the ammunition back. It's already expended. Yeah. But now Israel needs more basically Patriot missiles that to fire out of their Iron Dome, and they need the artillery shells. Now, I think Israel has a notorious track record of being very arrogant and overconfident and underestimating the enemy. I'm not to say that their anger in this is not justified, because the Hamas murdering these kids who were at a dance rave and women and children, it's just, it's uncalled for, it's wrong. Now, Hamas will turn around and tell you, well, they're just paying back the Israelis for what the Israelis did to them. And there is clear evidence over time of the Israelis killing women and children in Gaza. But, this thing doesn't get settled by deciding, well, who really threw the first punch? And, we'll accuse them of assault and battery and then let the other person go. This is so deep in the emotions of these people that there is no rational, sane way to talk them out of it. And so Israel is now claiming it's going to destroy all of Gaza. Now think about that. The Western concept has been up till now that you punish those who are guilty or responsible for the crime. You don't punish the people. You don't punish everybody in Japan because of World War II. And you don't, in theory, you don't punish everyone in Germany. And yet we saw during World War II that the United States and Great Britain, we killed massive numbers of civilians. We didn't draw a distinction. But after the war was over, we focused on punishing those who were in command, who made military decisions. What should happen here is Israel should be killing, capturing, trying those individuals who carried out those attacks against the civilians, who planned those attacks against the civilians, who funded those attacks against those civilians. As far as Hamas killing Israeli soldiers, hey, you put on a uniform, you get to carry a gun. That's the risk. It's sort of that part that's the ugly part of war, but that's not a war crime. But the other part of what Hamas did was a war crime, and yet what Israel appears ready to do is to commit a war crime. There are already images out there of Israel with captured Hamas fighters. They are stripped completely naked, hogtied, hands, feet, face down in the dirt. Now, do you believe that the United States military would allow its soldiers to act that way against any enemy combatant? They would be brought up on court-martial charges. And yet, because of the horrific things Hamas did, most in the Western world are just going, oh, well, these guys deserve it. And so whenever we get into that mentality, we just, all of our moralizing about, oh, the Holocaust was terrible. Well, we end up creating a rationale that foreigners they recognize we're not sincere about the international rules order that we claim to want to uphold.
Yeah, it does. It gets tricky. It gets emotional. This is a multi-decade, multi-hundred-year bad blood between these religious factions and this part of the world. Going back to Zelensky for a second, he is also saying that he has military intel that shows Vladimir Putin is the one supplying stolen weapons from Ukraine to Hamas. Now, if this is true, isn't he then taking United States weapons and giving them to Hamas via the Russian Federation army? So is there any truth to this? Or again, is Zelensky trying to keep the evil limelight focused on Putin so that he can get money and resources on behalf of Ukraine?
Well, see, here's what we know. We know that some of the weapons in the hands of Hamas, some of the rifles in particular, came from the United States. What's not clear is, did it come because of the rifles, weapons that we sent to Ukraine, or the weapons that we sent to the Palestinian Authority, or the weapons we left behind in Afghanistan? So we got three different possibilities where those weapons came from. And the only way you can tell is get the serial number and do a trace back. What's hilarious about Zelensky's claim, so let me see if I got this straight. You're beating the Russians, right? Except you got this material from the United States and you couldn't keep control of it because the Russians took it away from you. And once they took it away from you, they shipped it off to Hamas. Yeah, that makes sense, as opposed to the fact that we've already had reports going back to a year ago, July, by CBS, of extensive black market activity, that a lot of the material aid sent by the United States and NATO to Ukraine was making its way into the black market and overseas. And we've seen video evidence of that, at least out of Mexico, with like the Jalisco cartel, I believe, that was walking about with a Javelin anti-tank guided missile. So far in this conflict with Hamas, we've not seen the use of anti-tank guided missiles. What we have seen, though, is the use of a multiple launched rocket system, what they call the MLRS, that is a fairly sophisticated system. Where that came from, off the black market, was it supplied by Russia? I think that's highly unlikely. Russia in the past has always been very careful about who it gives weapons to. And the Russians have always been much better about keeping track their aid, much more so than the United States.
Yeah, well, my thinking was, okay, we know for a fact weapons and money are going into Ukraine. Uh, it's being stolen money. It's being taken by people high up in authority. Maybe there's kickbacks to the United States. Who knows? But there's also a lot being sold on the black market.
Yeah,
Now, when Russia takes over an area, I'm sure they're not like, good thing we captured this area and picked up their extra weapons so that we can send them to Hamas. I just don't believe that that's what's happening, especially because Putin has been receiving weapons from Iran.
yeah.
So it's not like
Well,
they're like, oh, well, we have so many extra weapons coming in from Iran. We'll take credit for diverting them back to Hamas so that they can attack Israel. It's like the flow chart and the logic just doesn't really add up.
yeah, there's always a lot of heavy propaganda element in this, where what concerns me right now is there's a lot of speech and writing in the West agitating for an enhanced escalation with Iran, going to war with Iran, attacking Iran, and that will be, as we talked earlier, extraordinarily dangerous, and will it will potentially expose the United States as a bit of a paper tiger. We've always talked a tough game, but think back even to the early days of the attack in Iraq in 2003. Despite all of our shock and awe, despite all of the bombing and all the explosions in Baghdad and other cities, the Iraqis didn't fold immediately. It took more than a month of combat activity to suppress then what was not a real air force. So Iran has a real air force. They have real air defense systems. So it would not be like fighting Iraq, and that's the danger here.
All right, I don't know if you saw this or not, but yesterday, Newsweek magazine floated the idea that maybe this attack was carried out because former President Donald Trump was careless with documents stored at Mar-a-Lago. What is the likelihood Newsweek is floating this idea to slander a man they don't want to become president again versus this being a true possible story rooted in reality? When I read that, I was like, everything gets blamed on Donald Trump. And now they're blaming this war between Hamas and Israel on Donald Trump.
Yeah, no, it's ridiculous. What magical document could allow that to take place? That what we're looking at is one of the most massive intelligence failures in the history of modern war. Israel didn't, they failed to detect this. Now, Hamas, one of the reasons, some people have, let me step back. Some people have speculated that, in fact, Bibi Netanyahu and the military command, they knew this was going to happen, that they allowed it to happen because they were looking for an excuse to destroy Hamas and to unify the Israeli public behind them. I think that's silly. I think it's ludicrous for the following reasons. Number one, Netanyahu has a divided government. So not everybody in his government's his friend. And if he did something like that, it would be very difficult to contain that intelligence, because it means that you're talking about Mossad, Shin Bet, and Unit 8200. So 3 different intelligence organizations in Israel that would have that information and suppress it. Somebody would talk. So far, nobody has. And if the word got out that Netanyahu knew it was coming, looked the other way, while Israel has suffered its largest loss of life since the Yom Kippur War in 1973, he'd be crucified, and probably literally crucified, not just figuratively.
Yeah.
So that's ridiculous. So what you've had here, though, is an intelligence failure. And that, I think that was brought on in part because Hamas, based upon my past experience, they don't deal with electronic communications. They're not sending text messages. They're not on their smartphones. They do things word of mouth, face-to-face meetings, and passing documents. That means you've got to have human sources that have penetrated, that can get that word out. This would suggest that despite Israel's reputation for having great human intelligence, they don't, at least with respect to Hamas. So Hamas was able to, put together this operation. It's not like they were massing forces with tanks. I mean, these were guys on motorcycles and paragliders. You get 5-6 paragliders in a field. They're either going out for a day of recreational flying, or maybe they're going to go launch an attack on a desert rave party. There's no way to know that. So this just highlights some of the limitations of intelligence, that human intelligence is still probably the most important tool you need for preventing surprise, because all the electronic collections, they fall short.
Yeah. Just like I had heard that they were trying to use artificial intelligence more than they had in the past. But like you say, having that human brain, that human eyeball, that human experience on the intel, on the data, still really makes such a huge difference when it comes to actually digesting the immense amount of data that comes through an intelligence apparatus on a daily basis.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just people call it their spidey sense. If you walk into an unfamiliar building and you see immediately a large dog dish and chains and bones scattered around on the floor, you might think, this may not be necessarily a secure location, or is there a big dog here? So the brain, you're right, the human brain has a capacity to identify some things that seem out of sort, but what this has exposed, it caught Israel completely off guard. And I can't emphasize enough that the West has this romantic fantasy about Israeli invincibility, superiority. And they forgot what happened in 2006 when Israel invaded southern Lebanon. In the past, they had always easily defeated Hezbollah. This time they got chewed up. Israeli tank columns were stopped, tanks were destroyed, tank crews killed, because Hezbollah had both improved in its training and in its tactics. And they were able to create bunkers, pillboxes, trenches, anti-tank devices. And it really, they beat the Israelis. And the Israelis came out of that saying, holy smokes, this is not the Hezbollah we knew. Now, Hamas has always lagged behind Hezbollah in terms of military organization, discipline, and training. And what I fear that, as Israel has announced, we're going to go into Gaza. We're going to go into Gaza. Okay, yeah, tell everybody what you're going to do so that they have time to prepare defensive positions, pillboxes, tank traps. And, Israel looks like it's sort of committing the same error that the Nazis did when they first attacked Stalingrad. They bombed the city into rubble. That'll teach those Russians, we're going to destroy all the buildings. Well, what it created were natural obstacles that tanks could not traverse, and natural hiding positions that soldiers could use to shoot from. As a result, it was the Nazis inadvertently constructed defensive positions for the Russians. And I fear that if Israel pursues this leveling of Gaza, they're going to do exactly the same thing. The only problem they face is, unlike Stalingrad, Gaza is 141 square miles. So it's a big, big piece of real estate, and it's heavily populated and densely populated with buildings. So Israel in the past assumed that it was always able to crush these guys. And yet, again, they're doing to the Gaza Strip what the Nazis tried to do to the Soviets and Leningrad. now St. Petersburg, surround it, cut off food, cut off water, cut off electricity. And the result of that by the Nazis was it killed almost 1 million citizens of then Leningrad. And, that's the same that could happen here unless they open up a a corridor that women, children, non-combatants can exit. So
Yeah.
we'll see what that decision is still out there to be made.
Yeah. Defense Secretary General Lloyd Austin has ordered aircraft carrier USS Gerald Ford to the Eastern Mediterranean to float off the western coast of Israel. Is that just a show of support to Israel? Do you think that they'll actually call on that aircraft carrier to send air defense or missile defense? And could they be opening themselves up to an attack, being in such a small, basically cul-de-sac area of the Mediterranean?
Well, this is not the first time the United States has put like a carrier task force off the coast of Israel, Lebanon. If you remember, back in 1983, the United States put its ships off the coast of Lebanon, and we were shelling Hezbollah positions in the Bekaa Valley. And boy, we were going to teach them a lesson then. And what did they do? They blew up the Marine barracks, and then they blew up the U.S. Embassy. So if we decide to militarily get engaged in this way, then we open ourselves up to, again, that kind of retaliation. Number one. Number two, these ships have limited tactical use. Yeah, they can launch airstrikes, but if the United States starts launching airstrikes on Palestinian civilian targets, because it's, within the Gaza Strip, we're not talking about fixed military Hamas bases. We're talking, this is civilian infrastructure throughout. And Hamas has inserted and, hidden itself within that. So we end up killing civilians. Well, that's not going to play well in the Arab world at all. The Arab and Muslim world will be outraged. And that outrage will then translate itself most likely into attacks on U.S. diplomatic and military facilities in other countries, as well as U.S. citizens. So, that's the second risk. The best the ships could do would be to ferry any American citizens that are in Israel that want to get out and can't because they've closed the airspace. And so to put them, ferry them out in boats and put them on the ships and then take them out of the area. So this is one of those sort of symbolic muscle flexing. And you make a good point that those ships, if they were in the Persian Gulf, I would say, yes, they'd be vulnerable to a hypersonic missile. It's not likely that any kind of attack on those ships will take place unless they engage in hostile activity against the civilian population. Then I think that takes their immunity off.
Okay, interesting. Thank you for that. Final question. Former Representative Tulsi Gabbard has spoken very openly about her worry that things could spin out of control between Russia and Ukraine and end up in World War III or worse, nuclear weapon use. Couldn't that same worry apply here, where something could spin out of control and suddenly this becomes a very heated war between Iran, and now Saudi Arabia jumps in, and Egypt jumps in, and the United States jumps in, and Lebanon, and it just, Yemen, and this thing spins out of control? Or are we kind of beyond that?
Well, I think it's far more likely here than it is with the war in Russia and Ukraine. At least with respect to Russian decision making, Putin's very rational. He's not emotional. He doesn't get so angry that he's just going to pound the table and say, we're going to kill them all, like you have American generals, retired, saying, like you have American politicians saying, like you have Israeli politicians and military personnel saying. I mean, it's irrational, it's emotional. And there's a scenario I can conceive that Israel gets into Gaza Strip and is getting chewed up significantly to the point that it's not going to be able to sustain that combat effort. And then you get infiltrations and attacks from other groups like Hezbollah on the north. The Taliban have talked about sending troops through Syria to attack Israel. And so if Israel finds itself backed into a corner, it very well could feel the need to use a nuclear weapon of some sort, like just in order to send a message, stop it or we'll kill you all. So that I think this thing with this war between Israel, Hamas, and perhaps the rest of the Arab world could get out of hand and make the nuclear option seem viable.
Yeah. Well, on top of that, then you add in the limited resource of oil, and you add in religious tension, where like Russia and Ukraine is USSR versus USSR, Slav versus Slav, Orthodox Christian versus Orthodox Christian, where here you have, Islam versus Judaism. You have this fight over oil, control for the Mediterranean Sea, the Holy Land, Abraham, these stories that go back for 2,500 years or so. So, well, Larry, I appreciate you coming on and sharing your insight. You've definitely made me think differently on several of these big topics. If people want to follow you for more information, what is the best way to do that?
I'm writing at sonar21.com, SONAR21.com.
Okay, I'll make sure to put that down in the video description and also the pinned comment so that people can follow you. Thank you very much. Always appreciate you. People love having you come on the show and explain things with your analytical mind. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.